This is the Tree of Life, Season 20, Chapter 8. In this episode, we will be talking about covariance during substitution events. We have discussed thoroughly how substitution events can be sequential, such as situations where a reverse substitution event follows a substitution event, or vice versa. We have discussed how substitution events are typically terminated by acquiescence linked to a negational bodily rhythm, such as represented by digestion. In other words, substitution events can be created by negation of the impulse to eat, i.e., sublimation of hunger, followed by acquiescence, or the act of eating at the conclusion of the event. Often, this leads to a reverse substitution following the acquiescence, where the original consciousness becomes the outgoing consciousness, and some other consciousness acts out the acquiescence until the conclusion of the reverse substitution. We have also discussed how substitution events can follow reverse substitutions, where the negation at the termination of the reverse substitution represents the beginning of a new sequential substitution event. In this episode, one of the things we will be talking about is the impact of this sequential substitution event on the incoming consciousness. Ordinarily, when a reverse substitution event stands alone, there is no link between the incoming consciousness and the outgoing consciousness after the conclusion of the event. But, when a substitution event follows the reverse substitution, the same consciousness, the incoming consciousness, remains associated with the objects of consciousness contextual to the vessel during the following substitution event. In other words, during the reverse substitution, the incoming consciousness is not spatially linked to the objects contextual to the vessel, but rather to the objects contextual to the self-representation. In the shifting from a reverse substitution to a substitution event, the objects contextual to the vessel are pushed up into the digital stream, displaced by the presence of the incoming consciousness around the vessel. In other words, when reverse substitution events are followed by substitution events, the incoming consciousness is both linked to the objects of consciousness referential to the self-representation in the reverse substitution event, and then linked to the objects contextual to the vessel, which are, within the substitution event, disconnected from the digital stream. Thus, the presence of the incoming consciousness around the vessel during a following substitution event becomes spatial. Now, substitution events and reverse substitution events can only be perceived during the transitionary period by the bifurcation of awareness. This occurs by consequence of a breakdown in covariance between the two streams. That is to say, just as reverse substitution events occur due to not following through with expression after acquiescence, resulting in the incoming consciousness acting out the impulse, resulting in emotional coupling and integration into the self-representation of the outgoing consciousness, bifurcation is caused by a breakdown in covariance. The breakdown in a link between the stream associated with the vessel and the digital stream centered around the self-representation. This is of course pursuant to tautological natural law, rather than hierarchical natural law, being the manner by which affirmational cycles are integrated into the self-representation of the subject. Further, a breakdown in covariance can also happen in reverse substitution events caused by hierarchical natural law. In this case, a sequential substitution event following reverse substitution may result in a realignment to a distinct hierarchy from the one which produced the reverse substitution. The presence of covariance reflects a phase overlap between the analog and digital stream. It's a measure of how the two streams remain interacting despite being distinct, such that shifts in one can be predicted by shifts in the other. Thus, a breakdown of covariance represents a decoupling of the digital and analog stream, which is why we see substitution events centered around the bifurcation. In the last episode, we talked about group sublimation as a form of reconciliation, a particular series of movements which links the analog and digital stream through the self-representation, as a bridge during a substitution event. What we see is that the movements corresponding to this process are common alignments of the spatial plates linked to distinct verbalizations. Since we understood that each movement in the sequence represents both negation and acquiescence or affirmation, each movement generates nested recursion. The common movements to both streams are those which terminate at the rest point, the spatial coordinates of the resting state between convoluted paths. The verbalizations associated with the two streams are distinct. But the analog stream is a reflection of verbalization during a nested substitution event following sublimation. Thus, the common series of movements are centered around the resting location, not the convoluted paths which depart from it. Reconciliation is thus a resumption of covariance, the re-establishment of a relationship of phase linking between the digital and analog stream. That's the end of the podcast for today.